What's going on, everybody? Jeff Holiday here, and today we're going to be talking about a crazy story and a little bit of science. Next to me here, this is Ted Williams, also known as one of the greatest baseball players to ever live, possibly the greatest hitter that ever lived. Ted was not only a man's man, but he also was a war hero. He elected to go to World War II, even though he could have avoided the draft. Because of his fame in baseball, he could have just played for the military baseball team and avoided combat, but became a naval aviator and fought in World War II. Then when he came back, he started playing baseball yet again, and yet again when the Korean War erupted, he went back, got back in the plane, even survived a plane crash. The man was a badass. So why are we talking about Ted Williams today? Well, it's because what happened to Ted after he died, and something that I'm really interested in. You see, as a person who embraces the concept of futurism and new and emergent technologies, I obviously keep my eye on things like, well, immortality. And one of those, and probably one of the wackier ones, is all about cryonics. Cryonics is the basic science of taking a person who has died right after death and freezing them and trying to preserve the body as much as possible so that someday in the future it can be reanimated. Now, Ted had a very interesting thing happen to him. You see, one of Ted Williams' sons, John Henry, became deeply entrenched in the cryonics movement, and he was you could say almost groomed into the idea by some of the people who were involved. One of which was a notorious figure known as Saul Kent. He became infamous in 1987 as he presided over the beheading of his 83-year-old mother, Dora. And what's kind of suspicious about it is it's theorized that it's possible Dora was not quite dead when she arrived at the facility in which she was to be forever interred, or at least her head was, and that she met her untimely end by the hands of people who were there going to be preserving her head. Now, it never got proven, it never got brought up on charges, and ultimately the police were like, meh, whatever, but it did lead to a very interesting documentary called I Dismember Mama by filmmaker Errol Morris. So, yeah, you might want to check that one out if you've got a morbid sense of entertainment. I do. So John Henry Williams was really involved in this whole idea of cryonics and living forever, and having a way that later on in the future both he and his dad could effectively be resurrected and rejoined. Now, he tried to get all the family members on board with this idea, including Ted, and it seemed to work for the most part, but it did cause a rift in the family. And to this day, there are still people who believe that Ted Williams himself did not want to be cryogenically preserved, and instead he did want to be cremated. It's still something of a debate, but ultimately at this point, it doesn't really matter. So in 2002, one of the greatest ball players to ever live and a war hero tragically died, and his body was transported to Alcor, where they sawed his head off and then preserved his head and his body separately. The process for doing so is rather gruesome, but interesting at the same time, and it has since remained there. Now, that's not the end of the story of what happened to Ted Williams, according to some. So let's take a look at this video where a whistleblower from Alcor has something to say.
And Larry Johnson is with us this morning. His controversial new book is called Frozen. He's with us live in the studio this morning. Now, did you go to work there before Ted Williams was brought there or after?
It was afterwards. I went to work there about 6 months after Ted was brought into that facility.
Right. And you allege that you saw his corpse being mishandled. What did you see?
I saw his head. What happens is they had his head in one, looked like a freezer chest. It's called a cryostar, and it was malfunctioning. There were some issues, so they wanted to move his head into another vessel. So they went to put his head in that vessel. What you got to do is, obviously the head's round. It's not going to sit upright. So they got a tuna fish can. They put it in the bottom of that vessel. They set the head on top of the can and then fill the vessel with liquid nitrogen.
Now, this is actually something that's rather common, reported from people who worked at Alcor. When they store the heads, they don't want the heads to roll around or to be flattened against a surface, so they use something like a can. Or for a larger head maybe like a Dinty Moore can. So this is kind of corroborated and a little strange.
Well, obviously, after 2 or 3 days of being in that state, when they pull you out, that can is stuck to the top of the head.
Right.
In Williams's case, that's exactly what happened. They pulled him out.
Right.
The tuna can was stuck to the top of his head.
Right.
A technician grabbed a wrench, a monkey wrench, took a swing at the can, missed it, missed the can, all right, hit the head, draw back again, a second swing, hit the can, send it flying across the room.
Gruesome.
Now, this is actually downplaying quite a bit by Johnson. He wrote a book about this called Frozen. It was all about the mistreatment at Alcor, or this, that, and the other thing. He made claims that the company would joke about mailing chunks of Williams' thawing remains back to his family if his son didn't pay his outstanding debt to the company. He claimed that tiny pieces of frozen head were flying all over the place when the dude smashed into Ted Williams' severed skull. A lot of this is really interesting because this guy ultimately was trying to paint this picture of just horrific abuses and just this terrible, terrible condition at Alcorn. Now, we'll get back to him in just a minute, but first, let's understand what this whole cryonics thing is about. One of the main problems with trying to preserve a body after death is that if you just simply freeze a body, we are mostly water, and when you freeze water, water starts to crystallize, and when it crystallizes, it expands, and it shreds surrounding tissues, especially cellular tissues. Now, if you're just trying to preserve a body, and the body gets kind of screwed up, well, that's unfortunate. Body's probably not going to work too terribly damn well if you can find a way to revive it. But in a brain, that's insanely difficult. That means copious amounts of brain damage. So what they do is, they pump out all of the water and all of the blood out of your body, or at least as much as they can, because it's pretty impossible to get all of it. Then they pump back in a mixture of effectively antifreeze and glycol to make sure that when it's frozen, it's more of a solid state, less than a sharding or expanding crystalline state inside the cells. Does this perfectly preserve the cells? No. Not at all, because, yet again, there is still going to be water molecules inside the cells, and there is still going to be quite a bit of shredding. So it's not just simply a matter of like, well, we'll freeze them, and sometime in the future when we have a cure for, say, their cancer, we cure their cancer, then we figure out how to reanimate them, and then they're fine. No, you have to repair them too, because you really fucked them up really bad. But on top of that, there's a whole nother problem with cryonics as well. You see, brains die. It's anywhere from about 6 to 10 minutes after your heart stops beating that you have the possibility of going into brain death, and your neurons start to die. They wither, and they die, and they're not coming back. That's why some people, when they've been brought back to life, have severe brain damage. They don't work the same, and they never will. It's irreparable brain damage. So, with that in mind, you have to understand, too, that, sure, if you manage when somebody dies to immediately freeze them and stop cellular brain death, well, you can't freeze it too fast, so they're going to have a little bit of brain death. Then, when you have to eventually revive them in the future, you're going to have to heat them back up. And if you heat them back up without having an ability to pump blood and oxygen into the brain and cycle it, then they're going to have more brain damage, more brain death. Not a good situation. A lot of people want to live forever, and I totally understand. There are interesting ways that people are going about trying to invent new ways to do it. Digital immortality inside of a computer, regrowing parts of your body as they start to fall apart. Some way of transferring your consciousness into a whole different body. Maybe a robot body, who knows? But cryonics is interesting because it's the only technology we have right now that, in theory, could work. In theory, we could someday resurrect Ted Williams. In theory. We know right now we can't offer somebody digital immortality or put them in a robot body or regrow their entire withered pieces as they start to fall apart. We can't do that, but we can freeze people. So it's understandable why some people are really encouraged by this technology. I totally get it. I totally do. But there's a lot of problems with it, and people who are fervently about cryonics, I would say, are bordering very close to the realm of faith. But if you got the money, I mean, you could. It's about $200,000 for your whole body. I think only $80,000 for your head. I don't know. I'm kind of attached to this, you know what I mean? So getting back to Ted Williams and Alcor and his son. Well, unfortunately, John Henry did die a couple of years after his father due to leukemia. But he, as well, was transferred to Alcor and frozen to hopefully someday in the future be resurrected. We'll see if it actually does happen and if Ted wakes up and smacks his son for not cremating him like he wanted. But there was also some other problems that were around with Alcor. There was rumored, now none of this is necessarily confirmed, but it was also rumored that one of Ted Williams' friends was actually smuggled into Alcor one night by a mortician friend, and he reported seeing pretty gnarly conditions. Williams' body and more than 50 others were stored in steel tanks alongside cardboard boxes and junk. However, this friend, Buzz Hammond, unfortunately committed suicide 2 years after Ted died, so we can't go back and ask him about it again. But now since then, Alcor has opened its doors and been very transparent with the public. Super villain looking Alcor president Max Moore here is very, very candid, gives many interviews, and he shows every aspect of the facility. And now, Alcor looks like a very clean and professional operation. And it's also not the only one. It's not the only corporation that's actually trying to find a way to preserve and freeze bodies. There's even one here in Oregon. So, is it becoming a big business? I don't think so. Not really. It's still very niche, but it seems to be improving at least somewhat, as long as you understand what it is and what it's not. Now, as for Larry Johnson, the guy who made all the claims about Alcor and the mistreatments and the abuse, and even claiming that possibly people had been unjustly life terminated for the process of cryogenic freezing, the story kind of ends a little unfortunately. See, back in 2012, he was forced to make a concession because he was being sued by Alcor, and he ended up going bankrupt because of the lawsuit. So he wrote this: "When the book Frozen was written, I believed my conclusions to be correct. However, information unknown to me and a more complete understanding of the facts furnished by Alcor contradict part of my account and some of my conclusions. In light of this new information from Alcor, some parts of the book are questioned as to veracity. For example, my account of the Ted Williams cryopreservation, which was not based upon my first-hand observation as noted in my book, is contradicted by information furnished by Alcor. I am not now certain that Ted Williams' body was treated disrespectfully, or that any procedures were performed without authorization or conducted poorly. To the extent of my recollections and conclusions were erroneous, and those recollections and errors caused harm, I apologize." And that would have been that, except all court orders remained in force to prevent further violations, which means Alcor wanted to make sure that this was staying in place and that they were going to ride this lawsuit out as much as possible. And it was found back in 2014, 2 years later, that the New York Supreme Court basically dismissed the case in favor of the publisher and the authors, basically saying, no, you could not sue them, you could not seek any further damages about it. This is just basically based upon how we are interpreting this case. So ultimately, it comes down to what you want to believe. Do you want to believe that there is this very strange loosey-goosey story about one of the most famous baseball players of all time being beheaded and then his head mistreated, or that perhaps maybe Alcor, in its infancy as a company, wasn't necessarily the most up and up as it was before, but has now been proven with plenty of interviews and examinations of their offices over and over again, pretty much on the up and up as much as you can be for a cutting-edge technology company. It's really up to you to decide. But there you go, that's the story of Ted Williams and his frozen head, of Alcor and the interesting cryonics movement and where it's at and where maybe it's going. The sad part about cryonics is that, unfortunately, they can develop better techniques and better methods for what they're trying to do, but ultimately, even people who are leaders in the field of cryopreservation, they have some disparaging things to say about the cryonics movement.
Now we're in Boston to talk to some scientists who research extreme temperatures. We're going to talk to them about cryonics.
This is a very complex problem, and they make it sound like, oh, if you vitrify, everything will survive. That's not true. The chances that you will bring the frozen head back is the same as when you go home tonight open the freezer, get the ground beef out, and make a cow out of it. So the chances of getting that head back with intact memory is a ridiculous concept.
And ultimately, it's a field of technology that moves very slowly because it relies entirely on the invention of things that don't quite exist yet. So, will we see a cryonics revolution in the future? Maybe, but it'll take a while. It'll depend on much more fascinating and interesting things happening first, but it's a cool thing to kind of examine and see where the whole thing comes from. Down in the description below, I've included links to several documentaries about cryonics. Really, really interesting stuff, especially the one from Motherboard. And yeah, I think it's definitely worth a watch. Stay tuned to the channel. Got a lot of new things coming up soon. A lot of fun stuff. A lot of big projects. Be sure and check out the links for the YouTube Saints down below. It's our weekly late night show that me and the Wizard of Cause do. But other than that, thank you very much for your attention. Hope you and your family are well. See you next time, and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.